On April 30th, 1975, a pivotal moment in history unfolded as the Fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War and the beginning of a new era for Vietnam. This event not only signaled the conclusion of one of the most controversial conflicts of the 20th century, but also set the stage for the reunification of Vietnam under communist control. The Vietnam War, a protracted and contentious conflict, began in the late 1950s and escalated throughout the 1960s and early 70s. The war was primarily fought between the communist forces of North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong, and the communist government of South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States and its allies. North Vietnam sought to reunify the country under communist rule, while South Vietnam, backed by the US, aimed to establish a non-communist state. The involvement of the United States was driven by the Cold War strategy of containment, which aimed to prevent the spread of communism. American military and economic aid bolstered the South Vietnam government, but as the war dragged on, public support in the US dwindled. Key events included the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, which led to increased US military engagement, and the Tet Offensive of 1968, a series of surprise attacks by North Vietnamese forces that shook American confidence in a swift victory. Despite significant investment and military efforts, the conflict remained stalemated, leading to growing anti-war sentiment and calls for the American withdrawal. To understand the significance of the Fall of Saigon, we must first explore the Vietnam War's complex history and its impact on the region. The conflict was marked by intense battles, shifting alliances, and a deepening crisis that ultimately led to the dramatic conclusion in Saigon. In the early 1970s, the Vietnam War entered a critical phase. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, aimed to end US involvement in the conflict and establish a framework for peace. Under the agreement, the United States agreed to withdraw its troops, while North Vietnam and South Vietnam were to continue their struggle to resolve their differences. However, the peace was tenuous, and fighting persisted between North and South Vietnamese forces. The withdrawal of US troops left South Vietnam increasingly vulnerable, and despite significant military and economic support from the US, the South Vietnamese government struggled to fend off the advancing North Vietnamese forces. By 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive, capturing key cities and cutting off crucial supply lines. The rapid advance of North Vietnamese troops towards Saigon marked the final phase of the conflict. As the situation became increasingly dire, the South Vietnamese government, led by President Nguyen Van Thieu, faced an inevitable collapse. As the war reached its final stages, diplomatic efforts and military setbacks set the stage for the dramatic conclusion. The Paris Peace Accords, while aiming to end US involvement, failed to secure a lasting peace, and the ensuing conflict led to the ultimate fall of Saigon, ending a protracted and divisive war. In the final months leading up to the fall of Saigon, North Vietnamese forces executed a meticulously planned and overwhelming offensive. This decisive campaign, known as the Spring Offensive or the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, began in March 1975. The North Vietnamese forces, led by General Van Tien Dung, quickly advanced through the Central Highlands, seizing control of key cities such as Pleiku and Ban Man Thiot. This rapid advance effectively cut South Vietnam off from vital supply routes and reinforcements. The North Vietnamese strategy involved a combination of military pressure and psychological warfare. By April 1975, their forces encircled Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The strategic aim was to pressure the South Vietnamese government into surrender by cutting off escape routes and overwhelming the city's defenses. The fall of key southern cities such as Da Nang and Hue in early April further exacerbated the sense of impending collapse, with the South Vietnamese military increasingly demoralized and disorganized. The North Vietnamese forces launched a decisive offensive, encircling and eventually overwhelming Saigon. Their swift and relentless advance demonstrated their strategic and operational superiority, leading to the eventual collapse of South Vietnamese defenses and the fall of their capital. As North Vietnamese troops closed in on Saigon, the US and South Vietnamese governments scrambled to execute one of the largest and most desperate evacuations in history, known as Operation Frequent Wind. This operation, carried out from April 29th to 30th, 1975, involved the evacuation of thousands of US citizens, South Vietnamese government officials, and other at-risk individuals. The operation primarily utilized helicopters to transport evacuees from key locations in Saigon, including the US Embassy and various military bases. The logistical challenges of the operation were immense, with helicopters shuttling evacuees to waiting ships offshore. The US Navy's aircraft carriers, such as the USS Midway, became temporary safe havens for those fleeing the city. The evacuation was chaotic, with many people desperately trying to board helicopters or find refuge amidst the crumbling order of the city. By the end of the operation, over 7,000 people had been evacuated, marking a desperate and frantic conclusion to the Vietnam War. In the face of advancing troops, the US and South Vietnamese scrambled to evacuate thousands, marking a desperate and chaotic final chapter. Operation Frequent Wind became a symbol of the frantic efforts to save lives as Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese forces. The Fall of Saigon was marked by several iconic moments that have become emblematic of the end of the Vietnam War. One of the most memorable images is the photograph of helicopters evacuating from the rooftop of the US Embassy in Saigon. This image, captured by Associated Press photographer Hubert Van Ness, depicts the desperate scramble of Americans and South Vietnamese as they sought to escape from the encroaching North Vietnamese troops. Another significant event was the fall of the presidential palace. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the palace, symbolizing the official end of South Vietnam and the victory of the North. The sight of the North Vietnamese flag being raised over the once symbolic seat of South Vietnamese power was a powerful and poignant conclusion to the conflict. The Fall of Saigon was captured in haunting images that symbolized the end of an era and the tumultuous aftermath of the Vietnam War. These iconic moments, from the frantic helicopter evacuations to the fall of the presidential palace, serve as enduring reminders of the conflict's dramatic and emotional conclusion. The Fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, marked the definitive end of the Vietnam War and the formal reunification of Vietnam. Following the collapse of Saigon, the North Vietnamese forces quickly took control of the city and the entire country. On the same day, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam officially surrendered to the North Vietnamese, effectively ending the conflict. The reunification process was swift. On July 2nd, 1976, Vietnam was officially declared the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, with its capital in Hanoi. The new government, led by the Communist Party of Vietnam, began the process of consolidating power and implementing socialist policies across the country. The reunification ended years of division between North and South Vietnam, but it also brought significant challenges. The new government faced the monumental task of rebuilding a war-torn country, integrating the economies and infrastructures of the North and South, and addressing the political and social upheavals that had accumulated over decades of conflict. With Saigon's fall, Vietnam was officially unified under communist rule, bringing an end to years of conflict and division. This reunification marked a new chapter in Vietnam's history, characterized by the challenges of rebuilding and integrating a country long divided by war. The Fall of Saigon had profound humanitarian consequences, significantly impacting the lives of Vietnamese citizens. The chaotic evacuation led to a massive refugee crisis, with many South Vietnamese fleeing the country to escape reprisals and persecution from the new communist regime. This exodus, often referred to as the Boat People Crisis, saw thousands of Vietnamese escaping by sea in overcrowded and perilous conditions. Many of these refugees faced harsh conditions, including starvation, disease, and piracy, as they sought asylum in other countries. In addition to the refugee crisis, the Fall of Saigon and the subsequent reunification led to widespread upheaval for those who remained. Many South Vietnamese who had been associated with the previous government or the United States faced retribution and were sent to re-education camps. The economic and social policies implemented by the new government also had significant impacts, including land reforms and the nationalization of industries, which led to economic difficulties and disruptions in the lives of many Vietnamese. The fall of Saigon had profound humanitarian consequences, with many Vietnamese fleeing the country and facing uncertain futures. The refugee crisis and the subsequent social upheaval left a lasting impact on those who had to navigate the challenges of a rapidly changing and uncertain environment. The fall of Saigon resonated globally, influencing international relations and U.S. foreign policy in the years that followed. For the United States, the end of the Vietnam War represented a significant and controversial chapter in its foreign policy. The war's conclusion led to a period of reflection and reassessment of U.S. military and diplomatic strategies, contributing to a more cautious approach in subsequent international interventions. Internationally, the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule was met with varied reactions. Many countries, particularly those in the Western Bloc, viewed the outcome as a victory for communist expansion, which influenced geopolitical dynamics during the Cold War. Conversely, some nations, particularly those in Southeast Asia, had concerns about the potential for further regional instability. In addition to political and diplomatic reactions, the fall of Saigon also influenced humanitarian and development aid strategies globally. The large number of Vietnamese refugees prompted international organizations and countries to respond with humanitarian assistance and resettlement programs. This shaped global approaches to refugee crises and international aid. The fall of Saigon resonated globally, influencing international relations and U.S. foreign policy in the years to come. The war's end prompted significant reflections on global diplomacy and aid, leaving a lasting impact on how nations approach conflicts and humanitarian issues.